Sometimes the things people throw away are the very things that can save us. Sometimes what looks like nothing to the world is everything to one man's heart. The wealthy Harlow family gave Elias Cord a falling-down cabin in the mountains as a cruel joke after a rigged card game. They laughed at the old mountain man, walking away with the deed to a worthless pile of rotted timber. But that cabin was where Elias was born 50 years ago, before the war took him away and life scattered his family to the wind. Now he's come home to rebuild it with his own two hands. What the Harlows don't know is what lies beneath that land. But what will happen when they find out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Elias Cord walked into the Grand Sierra Saloon in Pinewood Valley, he carried nothing but a worn leather satchel and 53 years of hard living etched into the lines of his face. The place smelled of tobacco, whiskey, and money, lots of money. Crystal chandeliers hung from timber beams that had been shipped all the way from San Francisco, and the bar itself was carved mahogany that gleamed like dark honey in the lamplight. This was not a place for men like Elias, and everyone in that room knew it. He stood just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Outside, the autumn sun was bright and clean, but in here the air hung thick with cigar smoke and the particular silence that comes when wealthy men stop talking to stare at something that doesn't belong. Elias was used to that silence. He had heard it in army camps, in mining towns, in lumber mills from Oregon to Montana. It was the sound of judgment passing without words. The card game was already underway at the corner table. 5 men sat beneath a painting of some Greek goddess or another, their vests buttoned tight over full bellies, their watch chains glinting gold. Elias recognized most of them. There was Chester Harlow, the patriarch of the valley's wealthiest family, a man who owned the lumber mill, half the railroad spur, and most of the land between the valley floor and the high country. Beside him sat his son, Garrett Harlow, a younger version of his father, but with meaner eyes and a quicker temper. The others were merchants and land speculators, men whose hands had never known real work, but who somehow controlled the destiny of everyone who did. Chester Harlow looked up as Elias approached, and a slow smile spread across his ruddy face. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Look what the mountain wind blew in. Elias Cord, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you down here in what, 5 years?" 6, Elias said quietly. His voice was rough from disuse, like a tool left out in the weather. "Maybe 7. Time flies when you're having fun, I suppose." Chester gestured to an empty chair with his cigar. "We heard you were back in the territory. Heard you were trapping up near Copper Creek." "Was," Elias said. He didn't sit down. "Beaver's mostly gone now. Moved on. Everything moves on, friend." Chester took a long pull from his whiskey. "Progress. That's what they call it. The old ways don't work anymore. Railroad's coming through next spring. Going to change everything up here. You ought to think about settling down, finding some real work. Man your age shouldn't be sleeping under pine trees." The other men chuckled, but Elias just stood there, patient as stone. He had not come here for advice or sympathy. He had come because word had reached him 3 weeks ago, carried by a supply wagon driver, that Chester Harlow had been asking about him, wanted to see him about an opportunity. That was the word the driver had used, opportunity. In Elias's experience, when wealthy men talked about opportunities for poor men, it usually meant someone was about to get swindled. But Elias had also learned, over a lifetime of hard lessons, that sometimes you had to walk into the trap to spring it. Sometimes the only way through was straight ahead. "Heard you wanted to see me," Elias said. "I did indeed." Chester leaned back in his chair, making it creak under his weight. "Got a proposition for you. A business arrangement, you might say." He paused for effect, looking around at his companions. "How'd you like to own some property? Become a landowner? A man of substance?" The other men were grinning now, in on whatever joke was about to unfold. Elias said nothing, just waited. Chester continued. "See, we're playing a little game here, poker. You know poker, Elias? Played some. Of course you have. Well, here's the thing. We play for stakes. Real stakes. Money mostly. But sometimes, he waved his cigar expansively, sometimes we play for property, deeds, land. Makes it interesting, you know. Keeps it exciting. Garrett Harlow spoke up, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who enjoyed other people's discomfort. Problem is, Father's been winning all morning. Won so much property he's running out of room in his safe. So we thought, why not do something charitable? Why not give some of it away to someone who could use it? The men laughed, and Elias understood then what this was. This was entertainment. He was entertainment. Chester pulled a folded document from his vest pocket and laid it on the table. This here is a deed to a piece of property up in the high country. About 40 acres, I'd say. There's a structure on it, well, what's left of a structure. Used to be a cabin long time ago. Been abandoned for decades. Roof's caved in, walls are mostly fallen, probably full of pack rats and pine needles. He pushed the deed across the table toward Elias. It's yours if you want it. No strings attached. Call it a gift from the Harlow family to an old mountain man who served his time in the wilderness. Every man deserves a piece of land to call his own, don't you think? The room had gone quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet. This was the silence of anticipation, of men waiting for the punchline of a joke they'd already heard. Elias reached out and picked up the deed. The paper was thick, official, embossed with the territorial seal. He unfolded it slowly, read the property description. Section 14, Township 9 North, Range 12 West, 40 acres in the pines above Elkhorn Ridge. His hands did not shake, but something inside his chest went very still. He knew that land. Knew it the way you know your own name, your own face in a mirror. He had been born on that land, in that cabin they were talking about. His father had built that cabin with timber he'd cut himself, back in 1822, when this whole territory was still wild and open and belonged to no one but the wind and the wolves. Elias had taken his first steps on that rough pine floor, had learned to read by firelight at that stone hearth, had helped his mother plant vegetables in the small clearing where the sun came through strong in summer, and then the war had come. His father had gone off to fight for the Union and never came back. His mother had tried to hold on for another winter, but pneumonia took her in February of 1863. Elias had been 14 years old. The cabin had passed into other hands. He had never known whose, and he had drifted, orphaned and rootless through the years that followed. The army, the mines, the trap lines, the lumber camps. Always moving, never settling, carrying that cabin with him like a ghost that wouldn't rest. And now, here it was. The deed to his own birthplace, being handed to him as a joke by men who had no idea what they were giving away. Elias looked up from the document and met Chester Harlow's eyes. The older man was smiling, waiting for protest or gratitude or confusion. Any reaction that would justify the entertainment value of this moment. "I'll take it," Elias said simply. Chester blinked. Well, of course you'll take it. I'm giving it to you. That's the whole point. Need you to sign it over proper," Elias said. Legal-like. In front of witnesses. Something flickered across Chester's face, surprise perhaps, or the first shadow of doubt. But he was in too deep now, and his audience was watching. He gestured to the bartender. "Henry, bring your pen and ink over here. We're doing business." The bartender, a thin man with nervous eyes, brought writing supplies to the table. Chester signed the deed with a flourish, then pushed it toward two of the other card players, who signed as witnesses. The whole time the men kept grinning, kept exchanging glances. When it was done, Chester handed the deed to Elias with a little bow. "There you are, friend. You're now the proud owner of 40 acres of worthless mountain land and a pile of rotten wood. Congratulations. Try not to spend it all in one place." The men erupted in laughter. Garrett Harlow slapped the table. "A real fixer-upper, as they say. Better get started before the next snow. Winters are hard up that high." Elias folded the deed carefully and placed it in his satchel. He looked at each man in turn, his gaze steady and without anger. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Gentlemen," he said. "Much obliged." He turned and walked out of the saloon, back into the clean autumn sunlight. Behind him, the laughter continued, rolling out through the open door like smoke. Someone called out, "Don't forget to send us an invitation to the housewarming." Elias did not look back. He walked through Pinewood Valley with his satchel over his shoulder, past the storefronts and the wagon yards, past the church with its white steeple and the schoolhouse where children were reciting their lessons. He walked until the buildings thinned out and the road turned to dirt, and then he kept walking, up into the hills where the pine trees began. His heart was beating steady and strong, the way it used to beat when he was tracking elk through deep snow or reading sign along a creek bed. There was no anger in him, no desire for revenge. What he felt was something simpler and more powerful: purpose. The Harlows did not know what they had given him. They thought it was trash, a derelict property not worth the paper the deed was written on. They had handed it over for a laugh, a moment's entertainment, a story to tell at the next dinner party. But Elias knew something they didn't. He knew that land like he knew his own bones. Every spring, snowmelt came down from the high peaks and ran through that property in 3 separate streams, cold and clean and constant. Every summer, the meadow on the south slope turned purple with lupine and yellow with arrowleaf balsam root. There were stands of old-growth pine on the northern edge, trees that had been growing since before white men came to this valley, straight and tall and perfect for timber. And beneath it all, running through the bedrock in a wide vein, was something else, something his father had discovered the summer before the war, but had never had time to develop. Copper. Rich copper ore, deep enough and pure enough to be worth a fortune if a man had the will to dig it out. His father had told him about it the last time Elias had seen him alive, the morning he left for the war. "Don't tell nobody about this, son," his father had said, kneeling beside the small prospect hole he dug near the northeast corner of their property. "Not till I get back. This is our future. This is what's going to make us secure." But his father had never come back. And his mother had died, not knowing what lay beneath her feet. And Elias had been too young and too scattered by grief to remember clearly where that prospect hole was, or even if it was real. But now he had time. He had nothing but time, and 40 acres to search. Let the Harlows laugh. Let them toast their cleverness and tell their stories. Elias Cord had come home. It took Elias 2 days to reach the cabin. He could have made it in one if he'd pushed hard, but there was no reason to hurry now. The land wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. He took his time, following the old trails he remembered from childhood, trails that had grown over but were still there if you knew how to read the land. The forest remembered, even if people forgot. He spent the first night camped beside Willow Creek, where he and his father used to fish for trout on summer evenings. The creek was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was bigger, but the sound of it was exactly the same, that constant rushing whisper that had sung him to sleep on 1,000 nights. He made a small fire, ate some jerky and hardtack, and lay back against his bedroll, watching the stars appear one by one through the pine branches. Sleep came easy. It always did in the mountains. The second day took him higher, into country where the air grew thin and cold, and the trees stood farther apart. He passed through meadows of dried grass that would be green again come spring, crossed boulder fields where marmots whistled warnings from the rocks, followed ridge lines where the wind came steady and clean from the west. This was the country that had made him, the country that had taught him everything that mattered: patience, stillness, the hard truth that you survived by paying attention. It was late afternoon when he finally saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing on a gentle slope, surrounded by tall pines that swayed and whispered in the breeze, or what was left of the cabin anyway. The Harlows had not been lying about its condition. The roof had collapsed inward, leaving the walls partially standing like broken teeth. The front door hung from one hinge. The single window was empty of glass, just a dark rectangle that stared out like a vacant eye. Vines had grown up the eastern wall, and saplings had taken root inside, where the floor had rotted through. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, just looking. Other men might have seen only ruin, only decay, only the impossible amount of work it would take to make this place whole again. But Elias saw something different. He saw the shape of what had been and what could be again. He saw his father's hands fitting those logs together, saw his mother hanging curtains in that window, saw himself as a boy carrying firewood across that threshold. He saw home. He dropped his satchel and bedroll in the clearing and walked slowly toward the cabin. The ground beneath his boots was familiar. He could feel it through the leather, the particular angle of this slope, the way the earth gave slightly where the pine needles lay thick. This was the clearing where his mother had grown beans and squash. That flat stone near the corner was where he used to sit and watch for his father to come back from checking the trap lines. The stone hearth still stood intact, blackened with soot from fires that had burned 40 years ago. Elias reached out and touched it, felt the rough surface warm from the afternoon sun. His mother had cooked on this hearth every day, had heated water for washing, had kept the fire going through the long winters when snow piled 6 feet high against the walls. He stepped inside carefully, testing each footfall before putting his weight down. The floor was mostly gone, rotted through and fallen into the crawl space below, but the joists were still there, solid enough if you stepped carefully. The interior was full of debris, fallen timbers from the roof, piles of pine needles, animal droppings, the scattered remnants of what had once been furniture. A rusted pot lay in one corner. Part of an old chair frame leaned against the wall, but the walls themselves, the main support logs, were still sound. Pine this old didn't rot easily. His father had chosen well, had cut the timber at the right time of year, had fitted everything together with skill and care. The bones of the cabin were good. Everything else could be rebuilt. Elias spent what remained of the afternoon clearing debris from inside the cabin, working methodically, piling the useless material outside in a heap that would eventually become kindling. He found small artifacts as he worked. A bent nail, a piece of blue pottery that had been part of his mother's serving bowl, a leather strap from something he couldn't identify. Each item he set aside carefully, as if they were treasures instead of trash. When darkness began to fall, he built a fire in the clearing using deadfall from the surrounding forest. He made coffee in his battered tin pot and sat watching the flames while the night sounds of the forest grew around him. An owl called from somewhere up the slope. Wind moved through the pines with that particular sound that was like breathing, like the mountain itself drawing breath. This was the first night in 40 years that Elias Cord had slept on his own land. He woke before dawn, as he always did, and lay in his bedroll watching the sky lighten above the trees. The air was sharp and cold, his breath visible in small clouds. Frost had formed on the grass during the night, turning the clearing silver in the early light. He made more coffee, ate some more of his dwindling supplies, and sat thinking about everything that needed to be done. The list was long. He would need to shore up the walls, replace the roof entirely, rebuild the floor, replace the door and window. He would need tools, good tools, not the few basic items he carried. He would need materials, lumber, nails, glass, stones for repairing the hearth. He would need time, weeks or maybe months of steady work. But first, before any of that, he needed to know if his memory was true. He needed to find his father's prospect hole. He spent the morning walking the property, pacing off boundaries, trying to match his childhood memories to the present landscape. 40 years was a long time. Trees had grown, rocks had shifted, the land itself had changed in subtle ways. But certain things remained constant. The angle of the ridgeline to the north, the way the 3 streams converged in the lower meadow, the shape of a particular granite outcropping that looked like a sleeping bear. His father had dug the prospect hole somewhere near the northeast corner of the property, not far from that granite outcropping. Elias remembered walking there with him, remembered his father's excitement as he showed his young son the greenish rock with the copper running through it. "See that, Elias? That's our future right there. That's what's going to make us rich. But where exactly?" The forest was thick here, and the ground was covered with pine needles and decades of accumulated debris. Any hole his father had dug would have filled in long ago, hidden by time and weather. Elias searched methodically, working in a grid pattern, examining the ground carefully for any sign of disturbance. any depression or mound that might indicate digging from long ago. The work was slow, painstaking. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward the western peaks. He was about to give up for the day when he saw it, a slight depression in the ground near the base of the granite outcropping, partially hidden by a fallen log. It was subtle, easy to miss, just a gentle bowl in the earth about 3 feet across. Elias knelt beside it and began clearing away the debris with his hands. The pine needles came away easily, and beneath them was a layer of decomposed leaves and dirt. He dug deeper, using a flat rock as a makeshift shovel. 6 inches down, his rock struck something solid. Not more rock, but something different, wood. He cleared around it carefully and found the remains of old timber planks, rotted and falling apart, but clearly placed there deliberately. His father had covered the prospect hole with boards to keep animals from falling in. Elias's heart began to beat faster. He pulled away the rotted planks, pulled away more dirt and debris, and there it was, a hole perhaps 4 feet deep, its sides still showing the marks of the shovel that had dug it all those years ago. And at the bottom, exposed where his father had left it, was a seam of rock running through the bedrock. Even after 40 years, even in the dim light beneath the trees, Elias could see the greenish tint, could see the veins of reddish metal running through the stone. Copper, just like his father had said. Real, honest copper, and by the look of it, a substantial deposit. Elias sat back on his heels and let out a long breath. For the first time since the war, since his mother died, since he lost everything and became a wanderer with no fixed place in the world, he felt something solid beneath him. Something real, something that was his. The Harlows had given this to him as a joke. They had mocked him, laughed at him, handed him what they thought was worthless land and a pile of broken timber. They had no idea what they'd done. No idea at all, but they would learn. Eventually they would learn. For now, though, Elias had work to do. He had a cabin to rebuild and a life to reclaim. The copper could wait. First, he needed a roof over his head and walls that would keep out the winter. First, he needed to make this place a home again. He covered the prospect hole carefully, replacing the debris so it looked undisturbed, and headed back toward the cabin as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The next morning, Elias walked back down to Pinewood Valley to buy supplies. His funds were limited, $37 saved from 3 seasons of trapping, plus another $12 he'd earned helping a rancher move cattle last spring. $49 total. Not enough to rebuild a cabin properly, but enough to start. The general store was run by a man named Samuel Potter, who'd been running it since before the war. He was one of the few people in the valley who'd ever treated Elias with basic human decency. And when Elias walked through the door that morning, Samuel looked up from his ledger and nodded. "Elias Cord, heard you were back in the territory." Samuel was a thin man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. "Heard something else too. Heard the Harlows gave you that old wreck up on Elkhorn Ridge." "They did. As a joke, I'm guessing. That was their intention." Samuel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "But not yours." "No, sir. Not mine. What do you need?" Elias had made a list in his head during the walk down. "Nails. 2 pounds of 6-penny, 1 pound of 10-penny. Hammer, if you've got one cheap. Saw. Hand plane, if the price is right. Some oakum for chinking. A length of canvas for temporary roofing. 50 feet of rope." Samuel wrote it all down, then looked up. "That's going to run you close to $20. You got $20? "I do. What about food?" "You planning to live up there while you work?" "I am. Then you'll need provisions. Flour, beans, salt, coffee, maybe some bacon." "That's another $10, $12 right there." Elias did the arithmetic in his head. $32, maybe $35 with everything. That would leave him $14, maybe less. Not much of a cushion, but he'd lived on less. "I'll take it all," he said. Samuel began pulling items from the shelves and storeroom, stacking them on the counter. As he worked, he said, "You know that cabin's been abandoned for close to 40 years. Roof's gone, floors rotted through. Walls are probably full of carpenter ants and dry rot. I know, going to be a hard job for one man. Most jobs are. Samuel wrapped the items carefully, tying them into manageable bundles. When everything was assembled, he tallied the cost on a piece of paper. "Comes to $33.40. Elias counted out the money carefully, laying the bills and coins on the counter. Samuel took it without comment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small cloth sack. "This here's some sourdough starter. My wife made it. You'll need it if you're baking bread up there. No charge. Much obliged." And Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what the Harlows are up to, giving you that property. But I've known Chester Harlow for 30 years, and I've never seen him do anything charitable without some angle behind it. You watch yourself." "I will." Elias loaded everything into the supply pack he'd brought, distributing the weight carefully. It was a heavy load, maybe 60 pounds all told, but he'd carried heavier. He was about to leave when the door opened, and 2 men walked in, Garrett Harlow and another young man Elias didn't recognize. Both dressed in expensive riding clothes. Garrett stopped short when he saw Elias, then a slow grin spread across his face. Well, if it isn't our newest property owner. How's the estate, Cord? Getting settled in?" Elias said nothing, just adjusted the pack on his shoulders. Garrett stepped closer. He smelled of cologne and whiskey, and his eyes had the bright, mean look of someone who enjoyed causing discomfort. "I was telling my friend here about you. About how my father, in a moment of extraordinary generosity, gave a worthless mountain rat a piece of worthless land. We were thinking maybe we should ride up and see how you're managing. Maybe bring some champagne, celebrate your good fortune." "No need," Elias said quietly. "Oh, but I insist. It's not every day a man becomes a landowner. That's worth commemorating, don't you think?" Garrett turned to his companion. "What do you say, Thomas? Should we ride up there tomorrow? See how our friend is doing with his mansion in the pines?" The other young man laughed uncertainly, glancing between Garrett and Elias. "I suppose we could—" "Actually," Samuel interrupted from behind the counter, "I need to speak with you about your father's account, Garrett." "It's somewhat urgent." Garrett's smile faded. "What about it?" "Perhaps we could discuss it privately." For a moment Garrett looked like he might refuse, but something in Samuel's expression made him reconsider. He shot Elias one more contemptuous look, then followed Samuel into the back room. Elias nodded his thanks toward where Samuel had been standing, then walked out into the morning sunshine. The climb back up to the cabin took most of the day with the heavy pack. Elias moved steadily, resting when he needed to, drinking from the streams he crossed, letting his body find its rhythm. This was the kind of work he understood, simple, physical, purposeful. One foot in front of the other until you reached where you were going. He arrived back at the cabin in late afternoon and immediately set to work. The first priority was shelter. He couldn't rebuild the roof properly yet. That would require cutting and trimming logs, which would take weeks, but he could create something temporary that would keep off the rain and snow. Using the rope and canvas, he rigged a makeshift covering over one corner of the cabin where the walls were most intact. It wasn't pretty, but it would do. Beneath this shelter, he could sleep dry and store his supplies. It was enough. As darkness fell, he made a simple meal of fried bacon and pan bread, using some of the flour and Samuel's sourdough starter. The bread came out dense and slightly burnt, but it tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. Maybe it was the mountain air. Maybe it was knowing he was eating on his own land, by his own fire, in the place where he was born. Or maybe it was just that. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Cord had something to work toward. Not just survival, not just getting through another season, but something real, something permanent. He sat by the fire late into the night, planning the work ahead. Tomorrow he would start on the walls, checking each log for soundness, replacing the ones too rotted to save. Then the floor joists, then the floor itself. After that, the roof. That would be the biggest job, requiring timber he'd have to cut and haul himself. The door and window could wait until later. First things first, the fire burned down to coals, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere up the slope an elk bugled, that eerie sound that was like music and loneliness combined. The wind moved through the pines with its constant whisper. Elias pulled his blanket around his shoulders and lay back, feeling the hard ground beneath him, feeling the weight of the mountain at his back. This was where he belonged. This was where he'd always belonged, even during all those years of wandering. He'd just needed time to find his way home. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tomorrow he would start building the life he should have had 40 years ago. The Harlows could laugh all they wanted. Let them ride up here if they chose. Let them mock and jeer. It wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't stop him. Nothing would stop him now. The work fell into a rhythm over the next 2 weeks. Elias woke each morning with the first light, made coffee and a simple breakfast, then worked until the sun began to set behind the western peaks. His hands, already calloused from years of hard living, grew harder still. His shoulders ached at night, and his back complained when he rose each morning. But these were good pains, the kind that came from building something instead of just surviving. He started with the walls, testing each log systematically. Most were sound, the old-growth pine having weathered the decades better than newer wood would have. But some had rotted where water had gotten in, and these he marked for replacement. Cutting new logs meant hiking up the slope to where the big pines grew, selecting trees of the right size and straightness, felling them with the hand axe he'd brought, then trimming and hauling them back down. It was slow, exhausting work, but Elias didn't mind. Each log he placed was one more piece of the cabin restored, one more step toward completion. On the 5th day, he had a visitor. He was working on the eastern wall, fitting a new log into place where a rotted one had been, when he heard the sound of a horse approaching through the trees. Elias straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and watched as a rider emerged into the clearing. It was a woman, perhaps 35 years old, sitting straight in the saddle with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. She wore practical riding clothes, split skirt, boots, a leather jacket against the autumn chill, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often, though she wasn't smiling now. "Mr. Cord?" she called out. "That's right." She dismounted smoothly and walked toward him, leading her horse. "I'm Sarah Winters. I run the ranch down in the valley, about 5 miles east of the Potter store." Elias nodded. He'd heard the name. The Winters Ranch was one of the older spreads in the territory, running cattle and some horses. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Winters?" "Miss Winters," she corrected. "I'm not married, and I'm here because I heard about what the Harlows did, giving you this property as some kind of joke. I wanted to see it for myself." "Well, you're seeing it." She looked around the clearing, taking in the partially restored cabin, the neat piles of timber, the makeshift canvas shelter. Her expression was thoughtful. "They said you were wasting your time up here. Said this place was beyond salvaging. They said a lot of things. I imagine they did." She walked closer to the cabin, examining the work he'd done. "You're doing this all yourself?" "I am." "That's ambitious." "This is a big job for one person. It's my job. I'll manage." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. Respect. "I believe you will," she said. "I came up here thinking I might find some foolish old man trying to prove something. But this," she gestured at the cabin, "this is real work." "Good work." Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Sarah continued, "I should tell you why I'm really here. The Harlows have been buying up land all over this valley for the past 10 years. They've pushed out 6 small ranches, bought properties for pennies on the dollar when people got desperate. They own the lumber mill, the railroad spur, most of the water rights. They're trying to control everything. I know the type. Then you know they didn't give you this property out of generosity. They're planning something. I don't know what, but Chester Harlow doesn't do anything without a reason. Maybe so. But the deed's legal. Samuel Potter witnessed it. The land's mine now, whatever their reasons were. Legal, yes. But that doesn't mean they can't make trouble for you. Chester has influence. He has money. If he decides he wants this land back, he won't get it." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe that too." She walked back to her horse, gathering the reins. I should go. But I wanted you to know, if you need help, if the Harlows start causing problems, you can come to me. I'm not afraid of them, and I have some influence of my own in this valley. Why would you help me? You don't know me. No, I don't. But I know the Harlows. I know what they've done to good people in this valley. And I know what it looks like when a man is trying to build something honest. She swung up into the saddle with easy grace. Besides, anyone who makes Chester Harlow angry can't be all bad. She smiled then, and Elias found himself almost smiling back. One more thing, Sarah said. Winter comes early up this high. You've got maybe 6 weeks before the first big snow. If that roof isn't on by then, you're going to have a hard time. I know. Do you have enough supplies? Enough food to last? I'll manage. She looked at him with that same appraising expression, then nodded. I'm sure you will. Good luck, Mr. Cord. She turned her horse and rode back into the trees, disappearing as quietly as she'd come. Elias stood watching until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then returned to his work. But something had shifted. For the first time since he'd taken possession of this land, he didn't feel quite so alone. Sarah Winters had come up here expecting one thing and found another, and she'd offered help without expecting anything in return. That was rare in Elias's experience. Most people wanted something, had some angle, some way they were planning to benefit. But Sarah had simply offered alliance and then left. The work went faster after that, though Elias couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was knowing that someone besides himself believed the cabin could be saved. Maybe it was the confirmation that the Harlows were indeed planning something, which meant he needed to work faster, build stronger, prepare for whatever was coming. Or maybe it was simply that another human being had looked at what he was doing and called it good work. That night, as Elias sat by his fire eating beans and pan bread, he thought about Sarah's warning. Winter coming in 6 weeks. The roof needing to be finished. It was possible, just barely possible, if he worked every day without rest. If the weather held, if nothing went wrong. He looked up at the cabin walls, solid now where they'd been broken, straight where they'd been leaning. He'd done more in 2 weeks than he'd thought possible. Maybe he could do the impossible too. Tomorrow he'd start cutting timber for the roof beams. Long straight logs that would span the width of the cabin and support the shingles. It would take a week just to cut and haul them all, maybe longer. Then he'd need to trim and fit them, build the roof frame, add the cross pieces. 6 weeks. It wasn't much time. But it was the time he had, so he'd make it work. He'd spent 40 years learning how to make things work with whatever time and materials he had. This would be no different. The fire burned low, and Elias wrapped himself in his blanket beneath the canvas shelter. Above him, through a gap in the trees, he could see stars scattered across the dark sky, like sparks from some celestial forge. The night was cold, but he was warm enough. He was always warm enough. Tomorrow the work would continue, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the cabin was whole again, and winter could do its worst without touching him. 3 weeks after Sarah's visit, Elias was making progress on the roof when he heard voices coming up the trail. Multiple voices, loud and careless, in the way of men who believed they owned the world. He climbed down from the roof frame he'd been working on and waited. Standing in the clearing with his hammer still in his hand, Garrett Harlow emerged first, followed by 3 other young men, all dressed in expensive clothes that looked absurd this far into the wilderness. They were riding fine horses and carrying rifles in their saddle scabbards, not working rifles, but fancy sporting guns with polished stocks and engraved metalwork. There he is, Garrett announced, as if Elias were some curiosity on display. The mountain hermit himself, building his castle in the clouds. The other men laughed. They dismounted and walked around the clearing, examining everything with the entitled carelessness of those who'd never had to build anything themselves. One of them kicked at the pile of lumber Elias had carefully stacked. Another peered into the cabin, making exaggerated sounds of disgust. "Good Lord, Garrett, you weren't exaggerating," one of them said. "This place really is a disaster." "I told you," Garrett said. "My father gave him 40 acres of worthless rock and a pile of kindling, and he actually thinks he's going to make something of it." Elias watched them, saying nothing. His grip on the hammer handle tightened slightly, but his face remained neutral. Garrett walked closer, looking up at the partial roof structure. "I have to admit, Cord, you've got persistence. Stupidity and persistence, but persistence nonetheless. How long do you think you can keep this up? Winter's coming. You know what winter's like up here." "I know." "Then you know you're not going to finish in time. Come first snow, this place will be buried under 6 feet of white, and you'll freeze to death in that pathetic canvas tent of yours." Garrett's smile was sharp. "Of course there's an alternative. My father's a reasonable man. He might be willing to buy this property back from you, give you enough money to spend the winter somewhere warm, somewhere civilized." "Not interested. Oh, come now. Don't be prideful. What are you going to do? Live up here all winter with no roof, no supplies, no way to get down to the valley when the snow gets deep?" "That's not bravery, that's suicide." One of the other young men spoke up. "Maybe he's got a death wish. Maybe that's what this is all about. They all found this amusing." Elias waited for their laughter to die down, then said quietly, "You boys should head back now. Getting dark soon." Garrett's smile faded. "We'll leave when we're ready to leave. This is still Harlow land, effectively. My father owns everything around here. You're just a squatter with a piece of paper. The paper says it's my land. That makes me the owner. That makes you trespassers." The atmosphere in the clearing changed. The joking tone vanished, replaced by something harder. Garrett took a step forward, and Elias noticed that the other men had positioned themselves in a loose semicircle. This had been planned, he realized. They hadn't come up here just to mock him. They'd come to intimidate him, to drive him off. "Listen carefully, old man," Garrett said, his voice low. "You're making a mistake. My father gave you this land as a joke, but the joke's over now. We want it back. You can take the offer and leave with some dignity and some money in your pocket, or you can refuse and find out what happens to people who don't cooperate with the Harlow family." Elias met his gaze steadily. "I'm not leaving." "Then you're a fool, maybe so. But I'm a fool with legal title to 40 acres, and you're still trespassing." For a moment, Elias thought Garrett might actually do something violent. The young man's face flushed red, and his hand moved toward his belt, where a pistol hung in a holster. But then one of his companions touched his arm and said, "Let it go, Garrett." "He's not worth it." Garrett hesitated, breathing hard, then stepped back. "Fine, freeze to death up here if that's what you want. But don't say we didn't warn you." He turned to his horse, then paused and looked back. "Oh, and Cord, that copper you think you found? My father knows all about it. He's known about it for years. That's why he gave you this land, because it's worthless. The copper deposit is too deep, too scattered, not worth the cost of extracting. So whatever dreams you're nursing about striking it rich, you can forget them." The words hit Elias like cold water. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, something went still. They knew. Somehow they knew about the copper. Garrett saw something in his face and smiled again. "Didn't think we'd figured it out, did you? My father's not stupid. He knew your father back before the war. Knew he was prospecting up here. After your family left, father had his own people come up and assay the deposit. Not worth mining. Not worth anything." He mounted his horse. "So you rebuild your little shack if you want. You're still just a poor man on worthless land, and you always will be." They rode off, leaving Elias standing alone in the clearing as the sun set behind the mountains. He didn't move for a long time. His mind was working through what Garrett had said, examining it from every angle. They knew about the copper. Chester Harlow knew about it, and had decided it wasn't worth mining, which meant either the deposit really was worthless, or Chester was lying, trying to discourage Elias from exploring it further. But why? If the copper truly was worthless, why bother coming up here to threaten him? Why offer to buy the land back? Unless it wasn't worthless at all. Unless Chester wanted Elias to believe it was worthless, so he'd sell the land back for a fraction of its value. Elias walked over to his supplies and pulled out the piece of copper ore he'd taken from his father's prospect hole. In the fading light, he turned it over in his hands, examining it. He wasn't a mining engineer. He couldn't judge the quality or depth of a deposit. But he knew his father. Knew that his father had been excited about this find, had believed it would make them secure. Had his father been wrong? Or was Chester Harlow playing a deeper game? Elias didn't know. But he knew one thing. He wasn't selling. Not for any price. This land was his by right, by blood, by memory. Whatever lay beneath it, whether copper or nothing at all, didn't matter. He was home, and he was staying. He put the ore sample back in his satchel and returned to work. There were still 2 hours of daylight left, and the roof wasn't going to build itself. Tomorrow he'd think about the Harlows and their threats. Tomorrow he'd figure out what Chester really knew and what he was hiding. Tonight he had timber to cut and beams to raise. The work was what mattered. The work was all that ever mattered. As darkness fell, Elias lit his lantern and continued working by its light, fitting joints and hammering pegs, building slowly but surely the shelter that would protect him through the winter to come. The first snow came early, just as Sarah had warned. Elias woke one morning to find the clearing covered in a thin blanket of white, the pine trees heavy with it, the world gone silent in that particular way snow brings. It was only October, too early for the snow to stay, but it was a reminder. Winter was coming, and the cabin still had no proper roof. He worked faster after that, pushing himself harder than he should have. The roof beams were in place now, solid and true, spanning the width of the cabin. What remained was the framework of cross pieces, then the shingles themselves. He'd split the shingles by hand from straight-grained cedar he'd found down the slope. Hundreds of them, each one carefully shaped with his draw knife. It was tedious work, but there was no other way. His supplies were running low. The flour was nearly gone, the bacon down to a few strips, the coffee almost finished. He'd been supplementing with what he could hunt, grouse, rabbit, one small deer, but he'd need to make another trip down to the valley soon. The problem was time. Every day spent walking to Pinewood and back was a day not spent working on the roof. He was considering this problem, working through the mathematics of supplies versus time, when Sarah Winters appeared again, this time leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. "I figured you might be running low," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to ride 5 miles up a mountain with provisions for a man she barely knew. Elias straightened from the shingle he'd been shaping. "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to. I wanted to." She began unloading the mule. Flour, beans, salt, coffee, bacon, dried fruit, even a small jar of honey. "I also heard Garrett Harlow paid you a visit last week. Figured you could use some friendly company after that. News travels. News always travels in a small valley." She finished unloading and looked up at the roof. "You've made good progress." "Not good enough. Need another 3 weeks minimum, and winter won't wait that long." Sarah walked around the cabin, examining his work with the practiced eye of someone who understood building. "The structure's sound. The walls are solid. If you can get the roof sealed before the heavy snows come, you'll make it through. That's a big if." She turned to face him, and there was something direct in her gaze that made him pay attention. "I could send 2 of my ranch hands up here to help. They're good workers, and I can spare them for a week. I can't pay them. I'm not asking you to pay them. I'm offering help." Elias set down his draw knife. "Why? Why what? Why are you helping me?" "You still haven't answered that." Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out across the clearing toward the mountains beyond. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. "My father built our ranch from nothing. He came to this valley 30 years ago with a wagon, 2 horses, and a dream. The Harlows were already here, already powerful, and they made it clear they didn't want competition. But my father didn't back down. He built his ranch anyway, made it succeed anyway." She paused, and Elias saw something in her face. Old pain, old anger. Chester Harlow tried everything to break him. Tried to buy him out, tried to intimidate him, tried to turn other ranchers against him. When none of that worked, he tried to buy the water rights to our creek. That almost succeeded. Would have succeeded if my father hadn't ridden to the territorial capital and filed his own claim first. Your father sounds like a good man. He was. He died 3 years ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fence. She looked back at Elias. Before he died, he made me promise something. He said, "Don't let the Harlows win. Don't let them turn this valley into their private kingdom. When you see someone standing up to them, you stand with them. So that's what I'm doing. I'm keeping a promise to my father. Elias understood that. Promises to the dead carried weight that promises to the living never could. All right, he said. If you can spare the men, I'll accept the help. Good. They'll be here tomorrow morning. She was right about them being good workers. The two ranch hands, brothers named Tom and Jacob Ellis, arrived at dawn the next day and immediately set to work without needing much direction. They were young men, maybe 25 and 28, with the easy competence of those who'd spent their lives working with their hands. Within an hour, Elias could see that the work would go 3 times faster with their help. Tom took over splitting shingles, while Jacob helped Elias with the roof framework. They worked well together, finding a rhythm, speaking only when necessary. By the end of the first day, they'd accomplished what would have taken Elias 4 days alone. That evening, sitting around the fire, eating the stew Sarah had sent up with them, Tom said, "Miss Winters told us about the Harlows coming up here. Told us to keep an eye out. Appreciate it." Jacob poked at the fire with a stick. "They've been causing trouble all over the valley lately. Bought out the Hendersons last month, practically stole their ranch for what they paid. The Hendersons didn't want to sell, but Chester made them an offer they couldn't refuse." "How?" "Called in some debts. Turns out old man Henderson owed money to the bank. And guess who owns the bank? Chester Harlow?" "That's right. So either Henderson sold his ranch to Chester for half what it was worth, or he lost it to foreclosure. Those were his choices." Elias stared into the fire. "That why you're helping me? Because I'm standing up to them?" Tom and Jacob exchanged glances. "Partly," Tom said, "but also because what you're doing here, building this cabin, making a home out of nothing, that's honest work. That matters. The Harlows get everything by taking. You're making something with your own hands. That's the difference. They worked for 6 more days. By the end of the week, the roof was nearly complete. All the framework in place, most of the shingles laid, just the ridgeline and a few sections near the chimney remaining. It was faster progress than Elias had dared hope for. On their last evening, as they prepared to head back down to the valley, Jacob said, "You need anything else? You send word. We'll come back up if we can. You've done more than enough, maybe, but Miss Winters would have our hides if we didn't make the offer." After they left, Elias stood in the clearing looking at his cabin. It had walls now. It had a roof, nearly complete, nearly weatherproof. It had a door that closed, and a window he'd fitted with oiled paper until he could afford real glass. It wasn't finished, but it was close. Another week, maybe 2, and it would be ready for winter. He thought about what Tom had said. Honest work. Making something instead of taking it. That was the difference, all right. The Harlows had wealth and power, but they'd gotten it by taking from others, by manipulating and intimidating and crushing anyone who stood in their way. Elias had nothing but this cabin and this land, but he'd earned every bit of it with his own sweat and determination. That night, he slept inside the cabin for the first time beneath the roof he'd built, surrounded by walls that had stood since his father's time. The wind outside made the pines whisper their ancient songs, but inside it was dry and still and quiet. It felt like home. It felt like sanctuary. In the morning he would finish the roof, and then he would start thinking about what to do with the copper deposit his father had found, and how to deal with the Harlows when they inevitably came back. But tonight, just for tonight, he let himself rest. 2 days after finishing the roof, Elias was working on the cabin's interior when he heard a horse approaching. He'd learned to distinguish visitors by the sound of their approach. Sarah rode with easy confidence. The Ellis brothers came in a pair, and the Harlows always made more noise than necessary. This rider was different, careful, deliberate, someone who knew how to move quietly through the mountains. He stepped outside and was surprised to see Samuel Potter from the general store, looking uncomfortable on horseback and slightly winded from the climb. "Samuel," Elias said, walking forward to help him dismount. "Long way to come for a social call." "This isn't a social call." Samuel's face was grim. He pulled a leather document case from his saddlebag. "We need to talk. Inside, if you don't mind." They went into the cabin, and Elias poured coffee from the pot that hung perpetually over his fire. Samuel sat on the rough bench Elias had built and opened the document case with shaking hands. "I've done something that could ruin me," Samuel said quietly. "But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." He pulled out a stack of papers, official-looking documents with stamps and seals. "These are copies. I made them last night after the store closed. If anyone finds out I took them, if Chester Harlow finds out, he'll destroy me. He owns the building my store is in. He could evict me tomorrow if he wanted to. What are they?" "Proof," Samuel said. "Proof of what the Harlows are really after." He spread the documents across the rough table Elias had constructed. 6 months ago, a man came through Pinewood Valley. He was a surveyor working for the Northern Pacific Railroad. He stayed at the hotel for 3 days, asked a lot of questions, took a lot of measurements. Most people didn't think much of it. The railroad's been planning that spur line for years. Samuel pointed to one of the documents. But this surveyor wasn't just planning the rail line. He was doing geological surveys, looking for mineral deposits. And he found something. Elias felt his chest tighten. Copper. More than that. Samuel pulled out another document, a geological assay report. "According to this survey, your property sits on top of one of the richest copper deposits in the territory. Not just a vein, Elias, a major deposit. The kind that could supply ore for decades. The kind that mining companies would pay a fortune for." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Elias sat down heavily on the bench beside Samuel. Chester knew. He was in the hotel the whole time the surveyor was here. They had dinner together multiple times. The surveyor gave him a preliminary report before he left. Samuel pulled out more papers. "These are land transactions. Over the past 6 months, Chester has been quietly buying up every piece of property adjacent to yours. The Morrison place to the north, the old Callahan homestead to the east, the territorial grazing land to the west. He got that through a friend in the capital. He laid out a map, hand-drawn but detailed, showing property lines. Your 40 acres is right in the center. Without your land, the copper deposit is much harder to access. The best approach, the easiest place to sink a mine shaft, is right on your property. That's why he gave it to you as a joke. He thought you'd try to fix the cabin, fail, and give up by winter. Then he could buy it back for next to nothing, claiming he was doing you a favor." Elias stared at the documents, his mind racing. "But I didn't give up." "No, you didn't. And that's become a problem for him." Samuel pulled out one more document. This came in yesterday's mail. It's addressed to Chester Harlow, from a mining company in San Francisco. They're offering to lease the mineral rights to the land around here for $60,000 a year, with an option to purchase for $500,000. The numbers were staggering. Elias had never seen that kind of money, had never imagined seeing it. $500,000. For land Chester had given away as a joke. "There's more," Samuel said. "The railroad spur? It's not going where everyone thinks it's going. The official route goes through the valley floor, but there's an alternate route, one that goes right past your property. That was part of the original survey too. They could bring rail cars right to the mine entrance, ship the copper straight to the smelters. It would make the whole operation 10 times more profitable." Elias stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the clearing, at the land that had been his father's, and was now his again. "Why are you telling me this? Why risk everything?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. "Because 30 years ago, Chester Harlow cheated my brother out of a timber contract that would have saved his business. My brother lost everything, his livelihood, his home, his pride. He died 5 years later, broken and bitter. I've watched Chester do the same thing to dozens of people over the years. I've watched him take and take and take, always hiding behind lawyers and contracts and respectability." He stood up, gathering the documents. "I'm tired of watching. I'm tired of being afraid. You're the first person in years who stood up to him and refused to back down. So I'm giving you these copies. Do what you want with them. But at least now you know what you're really fighting for." Elias turned from the window. "If he finds out you took these, then I'll deal with it. I'm an old man, Elias. I don't have that many years left, and I'd rather spend them knowing I did the right thing than spend them safe and ashamed." After Samuel left, Elias sat alone in the cabin, reading through the documents carefully, multiple times, making sure he understood everything. The geological survey, the assay reports, the correspondence with the mining company, the alternate railroad route, the property transactions showing how Chester had systematically acquired everything around Elias's 40 acres. It all made sense now. The rigged poker game, the public mockery, the visits from Garrett and his friends trying to intimidate him into leaving, the claim that the copper was worthless. All of it had been designed to make Elias give up and sell the land back for a fraction of its value. But there was something else in the documents that caught his attention. A letter from Chester to the mining company, dated just 2 weeks ago. In it, Chester assured them that he would have complete control of the necessary properties within 60 days. He promised that the current occupant of the central parcel is merely a temporary inconvenience that will be resolved. Shortly, a temporary inconvenience. That's what Elias was to Chester Harlow, an obstacle to be removed. But there was something in that letter that troubled Elias more than the insult. The confidence, the certainty. Chester wasn't worried about Elias refusing to sell. He wasn't concerned about the legal deed or Elias's determination, which meant Chester had another plan, something beyond intimidation, and offers to buy the land back. Elias thought about what Jacob had said about the Henderson Ranch, how Chester had called in debts and forced a sale. But Elias had no debts. He owed nothing to anyone. He'd paid cash for his supplies. The land was his, free and clear. So what was Chester planning? As the sun set and shadows filled the cabin, Elias realized something else. The document Samuel had brought changed everything. Before, this had been about rebuilding his childhood home, about reclaiming a piece of his past. It had been personal but small, a private battle that mattered to him but to no one else. Now it was about $500,000. Now it was about copper deposits and railroad rights and mining operations. Now it was about wealth and power on a scale that would reshape the entire valley, and Chester Harlow would do anything to get control of that wealth. Elias looked around the cabin he'd rebuilt with his own hands. The solid walls, the tight roof, the stone hearth where a fire crackled. He'd made this place whole again. He'd kept the promise he'd made to himself when he first saw the deed, to come home, to rebuild, to reclaim what had been taken from him. But now he understood that keeping this land would require more than just rebuilding a cabin. It would require outsmarting one of the wealthiest, most ruthless men in the territory. It would require strategy, allies, and a willingness to fight not just with hammers and saws, but with law and leverage, and whatever other weapons he could find. His father had discovered this copper deposit 40 years ago and never had the chance to profit from it. His mother had died not knowing what lay beneath her feet. They'd lost everything, the land, the cabin, their dreams of security and prosperity. Elias had been given a second chance. The land had come back to him through the Harlow's arrogance and his own stubborn determination. And now he knew what it was really worth. He wasn't going to lose it again. Not to Chester Harlow, not to anyone. The question was how to protect it. How to hold on to 40 acres of land when the most powerful man in the valley would stop at nothing to take it away. Elias sat by the fire late into the night thinking, planning, preparing for whatever came next. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, a man who'd spent his life wandering had finally found something worth fighting for, and he intended to win. Elias rode down to Sarah Winter's ranch the next morning, the documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into his saddlebag. He'd borrowed a horse from her the previous week and had been meaning to return it anyway, but now he had another reason for the visit. If he was going to fight Chester Harlow, he needed allies who understood what they were up against. The Winters Ranch spread across a broad valley of good grassland, with a sturdy house built from local stone and timber. Cattle grazed in the distance, and he could see several outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals. It was the kind of place that spoke of years of hard work and careful stewardship. Sarah was in the corral working with a young horse when he arrived. She saw him coming and handed the lead rope to one of her hands, then walked over to meet him. "Elias," she said, "I didn't expect to see you down from the mountain so soon. Something wrong? Need to talk, privately." Her expression changed, becoming alert and focused. "Come inside." They sat at her kitchen table, and Elias spread out the documents Samuel had given him. He explained everything: the geological survey, the mining company's offer, Chester's systematic acquisition of surrounding properties, the alternate railroad route. Sarah listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious as the full scope of Chester's plan became clear. When he finished, she sat back and let out a long breath. $500,000. That's what they're offering, and Chester thinks he can just take it from you. He's confident about it, too confident. Which means he's got a plan I haven't figured out yet. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at her ranch. "My father told me once that Chester Harlow's greatest strength isn't his money, it's his patience. He'll wait years for the right moment, set up all the pieces carefully, and then strike when you're not expecting it." She turned back to Elias. "The question is, what pieces has he been setting up?" "I've been thinking about that all night. I don't owe him money. The deed is legal and witnessed. I'm not breaking any laws. So what leverage does he have?" "Let me ask around quietly," Sarah said. "I have friends in the territorial office, people who owe me favors. Maybe I can find out what Chester's been doing behind the scenes." "I'd appreciate that." She came back to the table and looked at the documents again. "In the meantime, you need to protect yourself legally. These documents Samuel gave you, they're copies, right?" "That's what he said." "Then you need to make more copies and put them somewhere safe. If something happens to you, if the cabin burns down, if Chester sends men to steal them, you need backup records." Elias nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. "There's something else," Sarah said. "You need to file a mining claim. Officially register your intent to develop the mineral rights on your property. That creates a legal paper trail. Makes it harder for Chester to claim later that the land was never properly developed, or that the mineral rights should revert to him somehow. I don't know anything about filing mining claims." "I do. My father filed several back in his prospecting days. I can help you with the paperwork." She paused, studying him carefully. "But Elias, you need to understand something. Once you file that claim, once you make this official, there's no going back. Chester will know you've discovered what the land is worth. He'll know you're not going to sell, and he'll escalate. He's going to escalate anyway." "True, but this makes it open war. Are you ready for that?" Elias thought about his father, who discovered this copper but never lived to profit from it. He thought about his mother, who died in poverty, not knowing what lay beneath their cabin. He thought about 40 years of wandering, of having nothing and being nothing, of watching wealthy men take what they wanted, while people like him survived on scraps. "I'm ready," he said. They spent the rest of the day working on the mining claim paperwork. Sarah had forms and documents from her father's old files, and she walked Elias through each section, explaining what needed to be included, how to describe the property boundaries, how to document the discovery of mineral deposits. It was tedious work, but Sarah was patient and thorough. "The claim has to be filed in person at the territorial office in Helena," she said. "That's a 3-day ride from here. 4 in winter conditions. I'll leave tomorrow. I'm coming with you." Elias started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "You'll need a witness to verify the claim. You'll need someone who knows the territorial officials and can navigate the bureaucracy. And frankly, you'll need someone watching your back. If Chester finds out what you're doing, he might try to stop you before you reach Helena." She was right, though Elias didn't like the idea of putting her in danger. But this wasn't just about him anymore. Sarah had her own reasons for opposing Chester Harlow, her own promises to keep. "All right," he said. "We leave at first light." That evening, Elias rode back up to his cabin. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The cabin looked solid and welcoming in the fading light, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a fire burning. This was his home now, truly his, and he was going to fight to keep it. Inside, he gathered what he needed for the trip: dried food, extra ammunition for his rifle, warm clothes for the journey. He made copies of Samuel's documents as Sarah had suggested, wrapping one set in oilcloth and hiding them beneath a floorboard, keeping another set to take with him to Helena. As he worked, he thought about what lay ahead. The trip to Helena would be dangerous enough. Winter was closing in, and the mountain passes could be treacherous. But the real danger would come after they filed the claim. Once Chester knew that Elias understood the land's true value, once he knew Elias was committed to keeping it, he would have to act decisively. What would that action look like? Violence was possible, though Chester usually preferred subtler methods. Legal challenges, perhaps, though the deed was solid. Intimidation, sabotage, spreading lies about Elias to turn the community against him. All of these were in Chester's playbook, or something Elias hadn't thought of yet. Something clever and ruthless that would come at him from an unexpected direction. He slept fitfully that night, waking several times to sounds that might have been wind or might have been men approaching through the trees. Each time he lay still and listened, his rifle within reach, until he was satisfied it was nothing. Morning came cold and clear. Elias packed his saddlebags, banked the fire in the hearth, and locked the cabin door. A new door he'd built himself, with a strong lock he'd purchased in Pinewood. Then he rode down to Sarah's ranch. She was ready when he arrived, dressed for riding in practical clothes, with her own rifle secured to her saddle. They set out immediately, following the main trail that led east toward Helena, 3 days of hard riding away. The first day passed without incident. They made good time, stopping only to rest the horses and eat cold meals. The weather held clear, and the trail was still passable despite the early snow. They camped that night in a sheltered canyon, taking turns keeping watch. The second day was harder. The trail climbed into higher country where snow had drifted across the path. They had to pick their way carefully, sometimes dismounting to lead the horses through deep sections. By evening, they were both exhausted and cold, but they'd covered nearly half the distance. They made camp in a stand of trees near a frozen creek. As Sarah prepared a simple meal over their fire, Elias checked their back trail, looking for any sign that they'd been followed. He saw nothing, but that didn't mean much. A skilled tracker could follow them without being seen. "You're worried," Sarah said, handing him a cup of coffee. "I'm cautious." "That's not the same thing." Elias wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into his cold fingers. "I keep thinking about what you said, about Chester's patience, about how he sets up all the pieces before he moves, and I keep wondering what pieces he's already set up that we don't know about." Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "My father used to say that the best way to beat someone like Chester is to be unpredictable. Don't do what they expect. Move in directions they haven't planned for. That's what we're doing now." "Exactly. Chester thinks you're just a stubborn old mountain man trying to hold onto a worthless cabin. He doesn't expect you to understand the land's value. He doesn't expect you to have allies. He doesn't expect you to fight back intelligently." She looked up at Elias. "That's our advantage." Surprise, the third day brought them to the outskirts of Helena. The territorial capital was a bustling town, much larger than Pinewood Valley, with brick buildings and paved streets and the constant noise of commerce and government. It felt alien to Elias after weeks in the quiet mountains, but he pushed through the discomfort. They found lodging at a modest hotel, then made their way to the territorial land office. It was housed in a stone building near the capital, with official seals on the door, and the smell of paper and ink thick in the air. Inside, a clerk looked up from his desk as they entered. "Help you folks?" "We're here to file a mining claim," Sarah said. The clerk pulled out a thick ledger and a stack of forms. "Property location." Elias gave him the legal description of his 40 acres. The clerk wrote it down, then asked a series of questions about the nature of the mineral deposit, the date of discovery, the intended development plans. Elias answered carefully, using the language Sarah had taught him, making sure everything was documented properly. The process took nearly 2 hours. Forms had to be filled out in triplicate. Fees had to be paid. Witnesses had to be sworn in. Signatures had to be notarized. But finally, the clerk stamped the final document with an official seal and handed Elias a copy. "Your claim is now registered with the territorial government," the clerk said. "Congratulations." Elias took the document, feeling its weight. This piece of paper changed everything. It made his claim to the copper official and legal. It created a public record that Chester Harlow couldn't simply ignore or manipulate away. They stepped out of the land office into the late afternoon sun. Helena spread out before them, busy and indifferent to the small drama that had just played out in the office behind them. "It's done," Sarah said. "It's done," Elias agreed. "Now comes the hard part. Now comes the hard part. They would rest tonight, then start the long ride back to Pinewood Valley tomorrow. And when they arrived, Chester Harlow would learn that his temporary inconvenience had just become a permanent problem. The mountain man he'd mocked and dismissed had claimed his mineral rights legally and publicly. The land Chester wanted so desperately was now officially, irrevocably out of his reach, unless he could take it by force. Elias looked at the mountains in the distance, at the high country where his cabin waited. Whatever happened next, he was ready. He'd spent his whole life preparing for this moment without knowing it, learning to survive, to endure, to stand firm when easier men would have given up. Chester Harlow had made a mistake when he gave Elias that land as a joke. He'd underestimated what a man could do when he finally came home. And now he was going to learn the cost of that mistake. They arrived back in Pinewood Valley on a cold November afternoon to find the town buzzing with unusual activity. A dozen expensive horses were tied up outside the Grand Sierra Saloon, and through the windows Elias could see well-dressed men gathered around tables covered with papers and maps. "That's not good," Sarah said quietly. They rode past slowly, not stopping, but Elias caught a glimpse through the window of Chester Harlow standing at the center of the group, gesturing emphatically at something on the table. Beside him stood Garrett and several other men Elias recognized as wealthy landowners and businessmen from across the territory. "He's organizing," Sarah said, "bringing in allies. Then we'd better do the same." They went first to Samuel Potter's store. The old man looked up as they entered, relief flooding his face. "Thank God you're back." "I was worried." He stopped, glancing around to make sure no customers were present. "Chester's been asking questions about you. Where you went, who you talked to. He sent Garrett to my store twice, nosing around." "Did you tell them anything?" Sarah asked. "Told them I didn't know where you'd gone. Said mountain men come and go as they please." Samuel leaned forward. "But Elias, something's happening." "Chester's called in every favor he has. There's talk of a special territorial hearing, something about disputed land claims and proper development requirements." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. "What kind of hearing?" "I don't know the details." But Chester's brought in lawyers from San Francisco, territorial officials from Helena. He's building a case for something. Sarah's expression darkened. He's going to try to invalidate Elias's claim. Find some legal technicality, some procedural mistake. Something he can use to argue that the land should revert to territorial control, which means it could be auctioned off to the highest bidder, which would be him. Elias said, "Exactly." They left Samuel's store and rode to Sarah's ranch, where they spent the evening going over every document, every form, every piece of paperwork related to Elias's land claim and mining registration, looking for weaknesses, for anything Chester's lawyers might exploit. "The original deed is solid," Sarah said, studying it under lamplight. "Properly signed, properly witnessed. Your mining claim was filed correctly. I made sure of that myself. So what's he after?" "I don't know. But Chester doesn't make moves like this unless he's confident. He's found something, some angle we haven't seen." The answer came 2 days later, delivered by a territorial marshal who rode up to Elias's cabin with an official summons. Elias was required to appear at a hearing in Pinewood Valley in 3 days' time to address questions regarding the validity of land ownership and mineral rights claims on property described as Section 14. Township 9 North, Range 12 West. The document was signed by a territorial judge Elias had never heard of, and it carried the official seal of the territorial government. "It's a setup," Sarah said, when Elias showed her the summons that evening. "Chester's arranged this whole thing. Probably paid off the judge, certainly paid for those lawyers. Can he do that? Just call a hearing and try to take my land. If he can find a legal justification, yes. The territorial government has broad powers over land disputes, especially regarding mineral rights. If Chester can convince the judge that your claim is somehow invalid, or that you're not capable of properly developing the mineral resources, the judge could revoke your claim and open the property for auction." Elias sat down heavily. "After everything, the rebuilding, the discovery of the copper, the trip to Helena, the filing of official claims, it could all be taken away by a corrupt judge in a rigged hearing. We need a lawyer," Sarah said. "A good one?" "I can't afford a lawyer." "I can." She held up a hand before he could protest. "This stopped being just about your land the moment Chester started bringing in territorial officials and San Francisco lawyers. This is about whether people like us can stand up to people like the Harlows and have any chance at all. My father would want me to fight this fight." Over the next 3 days, Sarah sent telegrams to every lawyer she knew, every contact her father had cultivated over the years. Most were too intimidated by Chester's reputation to take the case. Others were already in Chester's pocket. But finally, on the morning of the hearing, a lawyer arrived from Butte, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Moore, who specialized in mining claims and had a reputation for not backing down from powerful men. "I've reviewed your documents," Catherine said, sitting in Sarah's parlor the night before the hearing. "Your claim is solid, but Chester's challenge isn't based on the validity of your paperwork. It's based on a territorial statute that requires mineral claims to show evidence of active development within 90 days of filing, or the claim can be challenged as speculative." 90 days, Elias said. "I just filed 2 weeks ago, I know. But Chester's lawyers are arguing that the clock started not when you filed the official claim, but when you first took possession of the property, which was 3 months ago. They're saying you've known about the copper the whole time and deliberately delayed filing to avoid the development requirement." The room went silent. It was clever, Elias had to admit. Diabolically clever. Chester was using Elias's own determination to rebuild the cabin against him, arguing that those 3 months of construction meant Elias had been sitting on a known mineral deposit without developing it, which violated territorial law. "Can they prove I knew about the copper 3 months ago?" Elias asked. "They're going to try," Catherine said. "And that's going to be the heart of tomorrow's hearing." The hearing was held in the Pinewood Valley Courthouse, a modest building that had never seen this much attention. Every seat was filled, people standing in the back and along the walls. Chester Harlow sat at the front table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits, looking confident and relaxed. Garrett stood behind him, arms crossed, wearing a satisfied smirk. Elias sat beside Catherine Moore, feeling out of place, in his best clothes, the same ones he'd worn to the saloon 3 months ago when Chester had given him the deed. Sarah sat directly behind him, a quiet presence of support. The judge was a thin man named Blackwood, with cold eyes and a manner that suggested he'd already made up his mind. He gavelled the room to order and immediately recognized Chester's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Pemberton, who spoke with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to winning. "Your Honor," Pemberton began, "this hearing concerns a clear violation of Territorial Statute 47, which requires mineral claims to demonstrate active development within 90 days of discovery. Mr. Cord took possession of this property on August 15th. He filed his mining claim on November 10th, 87 days later. However, we have evidence that Mr. Cord was aware of the copper deposit from the moment he took possession, which means he violated the spirit and letter of the development requirement." Catherine stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Cord filed his claim within the legal time frame from the date of his official discovery and survey of the mineral deposit, which occurred in late October. The date he took possession of the surface property is irrelevant to mineral rights development requirements. The surface property and mineral rights are intrinsically linked, Pemberton countered. Mr. Cord has admitted in conversation that his father discovered copper on this property 40 years ago. He knew what was there. He was deliberately stalling, allowing the property to appear dormant while he rebuilt a cabin, hoping to avoid scrutiny until he could file a proper claim. Judge Blackwood leaned forward. Do you have evidence that Mr. Cord knew about the copper deposit when he took possession? We do, Your Honor. Pemberton gestured and Garrett Harlow stood up. Mr. Garrett Harlow will testify that he personally witnessed Mr. Cord examining copper ore samples at the property in September, more than a month before the official filing. Elias felt his chest tighten. It was a lie. Garrett had never seen him with ore samples in September. But it was a lie that would be difficult to disprove. It was Garrett's word against his, and in this room, with this judge, Elias knew whose word would carry more weight. Catherine stood again, her voice sharp. Your Honor, this is hearsay and speculation. Mr. Harlow's testimony is suspect, given his family's obvious financial interest in acquiring this property. Furthermore, the territorial statute in question applies to professional mining operations, not to individual property owners making legitimate claims. The statute applies to all mineral claims on territorial land, Pemberton shot back. And the Harlow family's interest is in seeing that territorial resources are developed by those with the capacity to do so, not hoarded by individuals who lack the means or intention to properly extract them. The argument went back and forth for an hour, legal technicalities and precedents flying over Elias's head. But he could see which way the wind was blowing. Judge Blackwood's questions favored Chester's position. His rulings on objections consistently went against Catherine. This hearing had been arranged, paid for, decided before it even began. Then Catherine stood and said something that changed the entire room. Your Honor, I'd like to call Samuel Potter to the stand. Chester's confident expression flickered. Pemberton stood quickly. Objection. Mr. Potter wasn't listed as a witness. He's a material witness to the chain of custody of this property, Catherine said, and to the circumstances under which Mr. Cord acquired it. Judge Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. I'll allow it. Samuel walked to the front, looking pale but determined. He was sworn in, and Catherine approached him gently. Mr. Potter, you witnessed the transfer of this property from Chester Harlow to Elias Cord, correct? I did. Can you describe the circumstances? Samuel took a breath. It was in the Grand Sierra Saloon. Mr. Harlow presented it as a joke. He called the property worthless, said the cabin was beyond repair. He gave it to Mr. Cord as entertainment for his friends, never expecting Mr. Cord would actually try to make something of it. Did Mr. Harlow mention anything about mineral deposits? Yes. He specifically said the copper deposit was too scattered and too deep to be worth mining. He said it was worthless. The room went very quiet. Catherine turned to face Chester. So, Mr. Harlow knew about the copper deposit when he gave the property away. He knew about it, assessed it, and publicly declared it worthless. Now he's claiming Mr. Cord violated development requirements for that same deposit he declared had no value. Pemberton was on his feet. That's a mischaracterization, is it? Catherine pulled out the documents Samuel had copied. Because I have geological surveys commissioned by Mr. Harlow 6 months ago that show extensive copper deposits on this property. Surveys he never disclosed. Surveys that prove he knew the land's true value all along. Chester's face went red. Garrett took a step forward, then stopped, realizing there was nothing he could do. Judge Blackwood looked at the documents, then at Chester, then back at the documents. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. This wasn't going according to plan. Your Honor, Catherine pressed, Mr. Harlow orchestrated an elaborate deception. He gave away valuable property as a joke, hoping Mr. Cord would fail and he could buy it back cheaply. When that didn't work, He manufactured this hearing to steal it legally. But the evidence shows that if anyone violated territorial statutes regarding mineral claims, it was Chester Harlow, who knew about valuable deposits and concealed them while manipulating property transfers. The judge was silent for a long moment, trapped between his obligations to Chester and the undeniable evidence now before him. The courtroom held its breath, waiting. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the silent courtroom. He looked at the documents before him, then at Chester Harlow, then finally at Elias. When he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Based on the evidence presented, particularly the geological surveys commissioned by Mr. Harlow prior to the property transfer, this court finds that Mr. Cord's mining claim was filed in good faith and within all legal requirements. The challenge is dismissed. He brought down his gavel with a sharp crack. Mr. Cord's claim to both the surface property and mineral rights is hereby affirmed. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Chester Harlow stood abruptly, his face purple with rage, but there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make things worse. His lawyers gathered their papers in tight-lipped silence. Garrett looked like he wanted to overturn the table, but his father grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. As they passed Elias, Chester stopped and leaned close. His voice was low, meant only for Elias to hear. "This isn't over." "Yes," Elias said quietly. "It is." Chester held his gaze for another moment, then walked out, his entourage trailing behind him like the remnants of a defeated army. Sarah was there immediately, gripping Elias's shoulder. "You did it. You actually did it." Samuel Potter pushed through the crowd, tears in his eyes. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Lord, he would be so proud." Catherine Moore packed her papers into her case with a satisfied smile. "That was one of the more enjoyable cases I've taken in years. Chester Harlow has bullied this valley for too long. It was time someone stood up to him." Outside, the November sky was bright and cold, the kind of day where the air felt clean and new. Elias stood on the courthouse steps, looking at the mountains in the distance where his cabin waited. He'd come to this valley 3 months ago, with nothing but a bedroll and a worn satchel, a man without a home or a future. Now he owned 40 acres of land, a restored cabin, and mineral rights worth more money than he could properly comprehend. But more than that, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever, a place to belong. People who stood with him, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked, standing beside him. "Go home," Elias said. "Finish the work on the cabin. When spring comes, maybe start figuring out what to do with that copper. You could sell the mineral rights to one of the mining companies. Take the money and live comfortably for the rest of your life." "I could." Elias looked at her. "But I think I'd rather develop it myself. Hire local men, pay fair wages, do it right. That's what my father would have wanted." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like a good plan. You'll need help with that." "I expect I will. Then I expect you know where to find me." The weeks that followed were quiet ones. Winter settled over the high country in earnest, snow piling deep around the cabin. But inside, Elias was warm and dry. He'd laid in supplies enough to last until spring, and he spent the long evenings reading by firelight, planning for the future, and occasionally receiving visitors. Sarah, Samuel, Tom, and Jacob Ellis, even Catherine Moore once, checking on her client and enjoying the mountain solitude. Chester Harlow left Pinewood Valley 2 weeks after the hearing, relocating to San Francisco where, rumor had it, his business ventures were not going well. Garrett stayed behind to manage what remained of the family's local interests, but he was diminished somehow, less arrogant, less certain. The power that had seemed so absolute had proven fragile after all. On Christmas Eve, Elias sat by his fire with a cup of coffee, looking around the cabin his father had built and he had restored. The walls were solid, the roof tight, the hearth glowing with warmth. On the mantel sat the deed to the property, the mining claim certificate, and a photograph Samuel had given him, a faded image of his parents standing in front of this very cabin. Taken long before Elias was born, he thought about all the years of wandering, all the places he'd been and the things he'd seen. He'd thought he was lost, that he'd never find his way back to anything that mattered. But maybe he'd needed those years. Maybe he'd needed to become the kind of man who could stand up to someone like Chester Harlow, who could rebuild what had been broken, who could recognize home when he finally found it again. Outside, snow was falling soft and steady, covering the world in silence. Somewhere in the trees an owl called. The wind moved through the pines with that eternal whisper that had been singing since before his father's time and would continue long after Elias was gone. But for now, in this moment, he was here. He was home, and that was enough. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges and opportunities. There would be decisions to make about the copper, about development, about how to build something lasting from this second chance he'd been given. There would be hard work ahead, no different from the hard work behind him. But Elias Cord had learned something important over these past months. He'd learned that home wasn't just a place. It was something you built with your own hands, something you fought for, something you earned through determination and the willingness to stand firm when easier men would have given up. The rich family had given him a ruined cabin as a joke, thinking it was worthless. They'd been wrong about that, just as they'd been wrong about him. The cabin wasn't worthless. It was everything. It was the place where his story had begun, and now the place where it would continue. Elias raised his cup toward the photograph on the mantel. "We made it, Pa," he said quietly. "Took a while, but we made it home." The fire crackled. The snow fell, and in a small cabin in the mountains, a man who had once been lost finally found his peace.